Full Bloom is brought to you in part by the following. Welcome to Full Bloom, the award-winning show that celebrates life. Here's your host, Zita Christian.
Hi everyone, welcome to Full Bloom. I'm Zita Christian. With Veterans Day on the horizon, I wanted to do a very special show. I wanted to focus on the issue, the subject of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. And to do that, I invited my friend Ron Winter to come back on the show and talk about PTSD. He is uniquely qualified. Ron, welcome back. Thanks for being here.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.
So, I want to just mention, for the sake of those in the audience who maybe did not see you on an earlier show, a little bit about your own background, because I think it explains why I particularly wanted this gentleman to be on the show with me. You are a Vietnam vet. You flew 300 combat missions as a Marine helicopter machine gunner in Vietnam. You were awarded 15 air medals, combat air crew wings, and the Vietnamese Cross of Gallantry, among many other decorations. And I know that in your work as a journalist and in the writing of your own memoir, that you've covered a lot of things related to the Vietnam era. But tonight we're going to focus specifically on PTSD. So tell me what it is and what it isn't. Let's start there.
Well, what it is as the title says, it's a reaction to a traumatic event. In this case, war, in what you may have experienced on the battlefield. It has many other facets. You can find PTSD in other places, not just war. You can find it in police departments and fire departments, EMTs. You can find it in the average population when somebody comes across something totally unexpected that causes a trauma for them. The thing about PTSD, when I first started hearing about it, I was a reporter at the Hartford Courant back in the 70s. And talking about Vietnam was very much discouraged in the newsroom, and there was an attitude about just what a Vietnam veteran was, and it was a very negative attitude. Mm-hmm. But some reporters started doing stories about guys who claimed to be Vietnam vets doing these outlandish things that they said was caused by these horrible things they did in Vietnam. And for a while, I just assumed at the time that, well, the media is not going to lie about this, or these guys aren't going to lie about their service because you can find out too easily. Right. And it's odd because at the time I thought, boy, I sure had a cakewalk of a tour in Vietnam. And these poor guys doing all these weird things. What happened to these guys? I felt bad for them. Well, as the years went by, I learned a lot more about Vietnam, and I learned a lot more about the media, and I learned a lot more about some people who didn't necessarily do all the things they said they did, either in Vietnam, in some cases they weren't even there, or in this reaction to it. But what it has become in some regards is a cop-out by some people trying to explain away uncivilized behavior that has gotten them in trouble with the law. Oh, it's all a reaction to Vietnam. The truth of it is, there's a spectrum of reactions to traumatic situations. Yes. In this case, being in a war zone. And I don't think you can say it's a matter of strength or weakness of a person's mind. There's certain things that affect one person because of their personality and their upbringing and things that they saw may affect them more so than the man standing right next to them or the woman standing next to them. But there would be something else that would come up that might not affect them as much, and yet another person would. So there are triggers to PTSD, and those triggers, I believe, are as individual as the people who experience it and suffer from it. My feeling, after a lot of time now, in the early 80s, I was covering Hartford, and the vet centers opened up and started to become popular with the Vietnam vets as a place to go to talk, meet other veterans, hash out issues they might have. And I went down to cover a group session one night, and before it was all done, they asked me if I'd come back. because I'm just like I'm doing with you now, Zita. We all got talking, and I was not the outsider reporter. All of a sudden, I was one of them.
You were one of them.
And we all had our experiences, and I'm not shy about sharing my my details or my beliefs. And so we all I made a lot of friends there, but I learned a lot about it from the counselors, and I was able to write some good articles and help some guys out. But one of the things that I concluded, and I don't have any scientific study to back it up, but I got about 35 years of looking at this pretty closely. Number one, when you come back from a war, as we came back from Vietnam, literally plucked out of the war zone, and within a matter of a couple of days, back into what we call the world, civilization, for one thing, you are exhausted. And you are suffering from massive sleep deprivation. And this never gets addressed from back then to today with the guys.
I've never heard that.
You are so tired. There's no such thing as 8-hour days in 5-day weeks and punching the clock and getting off at 4. It doesn't work like that in a war. And if you can get a sleep, then you can just about be guaranteed that if you're in an area where there's an enemy activity, they'll wing in some rockets and mortars in the middle of the night just to keep things going for you, which we did the same thing back to them. So virtually across the board, if you've been in a combat zone, you're tired. You are tired beyond anything that you can imagine. And I didn't know how tired I was when I came back and how long I stayed tired until years later.
Oh my God.
Literally years later. So first and foremost, if I had any input on what to do about trying to address the issue of PTSD or any other of the impacts of war, number one, I'd do like a reverse boot camp. You take people out of society and you send them down to boot camp for 3 months to turn them into warriors. Then you send them to war, and you pluck them out of the war zone and drop them back into society without any decompression. Well, I don't know if it would take 3 months, but maybe 1 month. Just bring the guys back, let them sleep, put them on a regular schedule, regular food, regular sleep, regular exercise, and no stress. Just decompress, for starters. That never happens. It should. The other thing, we can talk about this at any point you like, but there's a lot of comparisons between World War II and Vietnam about how we came home and with whom, and did we ever get a chance to talk about this. And in our case, in the Vietnam veteran case, no, we didn't. We not only came home individually, in many cases, we came home to a hostile country, or at least an indifferent country. It certainly wasn't a welcoming country. And so the whole sense of just talking things over and putting things in perspective, and in other interviews I've done that I've told you about in other shows, when you start to talk to guys who have 3 different views of the same thing, but all of a sudden they get the chance to put them together, what a miraculous thing happens. Guys just open up, like the clouds going away on a rainy day, and all of a sudden the sun comes out and they start talking with you and they compare notes, and all of a sudden they have a complete picture of what it was they were involved in. And quite often that's missing.
Yeah, you don't know what you're part of. But I want you to stay on this subject for a minute about the whole idea of comparing Vietnam, Afghanistan, World War II, talking about that whole idea of coming home on a couple of people on a plane versus a couple of dozen, 100 people on a ship, where it's going to take 4 or 5 days, a week, 2 weeks for transport, so that there is some opportunity for, in some instances, for the combat soldiers to interact with others who were there at the same time. So there's some kind of a release with you're with somebody who knows what you went through, as opposed to suddenly you're in this world and suddenly you're in this world, and they are diametrically opposite.
Well, there's stereotypes, and we have to be careful of them. They talk about the World War II vets coming back from overseas on the troop ships, and for many, many, many of them, that's absolutely true. But my father was there. My dad was out. He was sunk in the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October of 1944. His ship was sunk, the USS Princeton. He was rescued. He got blown off the ship when it exploded. He was out in the water for 3 hours. He finally was rescued. Eventually was brought back to Bremerton, Washington, where he was assigned to another ship, the USS Siboney, and they sailed out of San Diego in the summer of 1945. And by the time they were back out in the Western Pacific, the invasion of Okinawa was over, and they were starting to mass for what was going to be the invasion of the Japanese main islands, and the atomic bomb was dropped, and the war was over. So my father didn't get to just turn around and come back home. They sent his ship up to Japan, and he spent a couple of months up there on occupation duty. So by the time he did get back home, which was right around Thanksgiving of 1945, he told me, he said he got to San Diego. He said, you know, when I left San Diego, you walked in a bar in uniform, you couldn't buy a drink all night long. He said, when I got back home, the war was over, everybody was winding down. He said, they had signs out there that said, sailors and dogs keep off the grass. you know, so everybody didn't get the same way. And I, after I learned what PTSD was, realized my father suffered from it. But that World War II mentality was the stiff upper lip. You don't complain about it. You don't talk about it. But one of the things they never tell you is an awful lot of World War II vets resorted to alcohol and became alcoholics. Yeah. And if they went into the care of either the state or the federal veterans system, they pretty much were just warehoused. You know, and that didn't solve any problems. No. And I can tell you this from my own experience, that the vast majority of guys that I grew up with before I went in the Marines had fathers who served in World War II, and most of them were in combat, and all of them were very quick with their fists, very prone to strike out and whack you. You know, far too many of them drank too much, yeah. And none of them ever talked about this having any connection whatsoever to do with the war. But from my vantage point now, and I look back then, I said, oh yeah, those guys could have used a little counseling themselves.
Well, and I want to talk about your vantage point. You were a Marine, you were in Vietnam, a lot of battles, a lot of decorations. You saw the kind of things that people write about, make movies about. Did you suffer PTSD?
Not on the media scale of what they call PTSD, never. I like to tell the story. I mean, they said, I printed out a thing from the Mayo Clinic earlier today to bring with me, and they were talking about some of the things, and they said, you know, recurrent memories. Not really. Reliving the trauma. Here's what great. Reliving the trauma. This is the one that always got me when people really do these outlandish things. Like, somebody asked me about that once. I said, stop and think about this for a minute. I was in a semi-tropical country. Where we were was close to the coast, so it was all white sand. The further we went inland, it became grass, and then rolling hills, and then mountains and jungles, triple canopy jungles. I was in a helicopter, a lot, flying and shooting a machine gun. At nighttime, they would shoot rockets and mortars in at us. Now, how do I recreate that here at home? It's not going to happen. If I hear a Chinook, which is similar to the 46s that we were in, that flies out of Bradley, go over my house, I always stop and look up because I love that sound. It doesn't bother me. I like it. You know. So how can I recreate this way out, this flashback? Now, I'm not saying for a minute that people don't have them. They do. But for me, it'd be very, very difficult to recreate conditions that in some way or another would flash off some negative response.
But it had to have affected you.
Oh, absolutely. Oh, absolutely. There's little things, and that's why I say there's a spectrum. There's little things. I always used to laugh about my son, who was a real wit and still is. And one of the big things about it, you know, was if you were in a lot of places where a lot of things went bang, you know, don't go bang behind him. Well, my son would go bang behind me a lot. He'd throw a book off a table, or he'd slam a door, and he'd do it. But the thing was, there was a method to his own madness, because I didn't flip out and go hiding under the table or something like. You know, first few times, like, will you stop that? You know, and then he'd just laughing, but he'd get talking about it. And I tell them, I would explain to them what the sound of a real mortar or rocket coming in actually sounded like.
But you like to talk about it, though.
Yeah.
What about the people who don't? What about
Then
the people who are bottling it up?
they are the ones who are going to have the most problems. And I honestly believe that the first thing that you need to get is to get on a regular routine as fast as possible with as much sleep as fast as possible, and then the opportunity. Even if you're in a group of guys and you're just sitting there listening to them talking, it's still better than the reception I got, which was nobody wanted to hear about it, and they shut me down. And I told you this privately a while back, but my wife Jennifer was the first person ever to ask me about Vietnam, because she had come to work at the Hartford Courant, and we'd been there working in the same office for a while, and somebody brought something up. And even, all the other reporters, they would, don't talk about Vietnam around. Like,
Oh, they think you
why?
were going to explode or something?
Well, I was in a conversation several years earlier where the look had started to develop. You had to have a raggy old uniform and be unshaven and stare. And, this stuff a lot of times came from people who weren't there. But that's what they developed as our appearance. So people were talking about it in the office one time, and they were really, really down on Vietnam vets. And I just turned to them and I said, guys know that I fought over there in the Marines? And it was like, oh, you were there? Yeah, I was there. What's the problem? Why are you talking about us like this? I don't know what some guy's doing out on the street, but I know that all the guys I know don't do that.
Well, and I want to get into that, because from what I understand, there are a lot of people who will file for some sort of a benefit or something, and they don't have...
It's literally a cottage industry, and I got a call from an editor I worked with. I got the call a couple of years ago, and she told me they were going to do a project on homeless Vietnam veterans.
Yeah.
And all these things that affect them. And I said, well, before you start your interviews, make sure you get their DD-214. And she didn't know what a DD-214 was. It's Department of Defense Form 214. You get it upon discharge. It says who you are, where you went in, what rank you attained, any schools you went to, any combat you were in, if you're overseas. Yeah. It's a one-page synopsis of what you did and medals you may have received. There's backup documentation if you get more medals, after on that you can get from the VA. But I said, this will tell you if a guy's been in and if he's been in combat, or a woman. And a couple months later, I heard from her that the whole project was scrapped because all the veterans that they were going to interview, turns out nobody could produce a DD-214. Now, why would you do that? You would do that because if you can get the VA to give you a disability rating for PTSD, especially if they give you a 100% disability rating for being unable to work or perform normal things in society, you're bringing home about $4,000 a month in tax-free income. So there have been unscrupulous people who either try to create a war record that doesn't exist and hope they're not going to get caught up in the paperwork, and some who actually had a record of some kind who try to embellish on that and make it a lot worse than what it was.
But I want to let people know, though, that those who are suffering and their families, I mean, when it affects other people too, that there is help available, that there is at least, there's a website people can go to and at least start exploring some of the options. So talk a little bit about, like, it's not hopeless.
Oh, it's not hopeless at all. And I just wanted to tell you, there was something here in the Mayo Clinic writing it. When to see a doctor.
Yeah.
If you have disturbing thoughts and feelings about a traumatic event for more than a month. For more than a month. Now, what does that say to you, for more than a month? That says that these things can and do go away.
Yeah. Yeah.
And there's something in this case, if you've had it that long and it hasn't gone away, you may not be taking the steps that you need to take to help get it in perspective, or you may actually need something more. You may need a lot more counseling or whatever will be available to you. And that's the time when you should go see a medical professional and find out what it's really all about. But here's the thing. We talked about World War II in Vietnam, and we'll talk a little more about Afghanistan and Iraq, but this post-traumatic stress has been around as long as people have been at war.
Oh, yes.
And war is not a natural human condition. Going out and killing other people is not natural. So they say. For some people, maybe it is, but most of us, it's not. Now, I told you that I was watching a History Channel show on battles BC, they call it, ancient biblical era battles. And they talked about Moses bringing the Israelites out of Egypt and crossing the Sea of Reeds and getting into the Sinai Peninsula, and they were attacked there. And that's where Joshua first came up as a military person. He was very, very successful in working with Moses and in fending off the attackers and all. But one of the things they don't tell you in Sunday school is when these biblical battles occurred, everybody on the losing side died. Everybody. And if they attacked like a city-state or some kind of a fortification, everybody in there died. Men, women, and children. That's what they all did back then. Everybody. Oh. And the impact on the fighters was enormous. I never knew this before till I saw this on this show. In the Israelite army, after a battle, all the fighters were required to stay separate from the main base or camp, wherever it was they were, for 7 days and 7 nights. And the purpose was to cleanse their bodies, to heal their wounds or start to heal their wounds, and to cleanse their minds. They knew 3,000 years ago that there needed to be a downtime.
Yes.
And that's something that we don't acknowledge in the modern day, in the modern era, with all the fighting that's going on, all the fighting that's going to go on. We don't acknowledge it. When you bring our fighters, our warriors back, they're going to need a little downtime.
You know, Ron, I know, though, a friend of mine who grew up on a reservation in the Southwest, she told me about a custom, a tradition, a practice in some Native American tribes that when the soldiers, Native American soldiers would come back from war, Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq, they spend time with the grandmothers in the tribe. They have to. It is a requirement that they spend time with the grandmothers until the grandmothers deem them fit to go back into society.
How about that?
And that they are cared for. They are to sleep and to be fed and to remove the stress and to
and look what they're giving them. Yeah. They're giving them a nice routine, a stable routine, and rest.
Rest.
And the most, probably the least threatening of all the people in the tribe.
That's right.
So you get a sense of security back. It's very difficult. You ask me, did it ever affect me? I don't call it sleeplessness, but I do have broken sleep. And it always comes at the same time. And I found out at the reunion down in Memphis in June with my buddies, a lot of us are on the same sleep cycle because we used to get rocketed or mortared at just about the same time at night, in the middle of the night. Well, we got to a point where you knew it was coming, so you'd wake up and you'd be ready. You had one of two things to do. If you were on a reactionary platoon, you grabbed your pack helmet rifle, went down to the perimeter to a pre-established fighting position, just in case there was a physical attack on the perimeter. Otherwise, you headed for your bunker. And I preferred to be in the fighting position in the bunker because the last place in the world you want to be is in a bunker when they're walking rockets in on you because you can't do anything. You're absolutely helpless. So yeah, that's mine. That's my I walk fire watch at a specified time or guard, perimeter guard every night. And all I did to deal with it is I just changed my sleep habits so that there's a time that comes when I feel secure and everything's all right, and I'll go to sleep just like that. And I'll sleep a little bit into the morning. And, sometimes when I'm up in the middle of the night, I work. I go down to the office and crank on the computer, and I get a lot done. Yeah. I just make useful time out of it, that's all.
Well, and see, I think, I don't know that, I guess yes, in many ways that you would be typical of some things, but in other ways, you are not. I know that it has often been suggested that as a way of therapy for people dealing with some kind of a trauma, that they write.
Yes.
That's something that's comfortable for you.
Yes.
So to use writing, whether it's writing poetry or writing a journal entry or painting or something like that, there is some kind of an activity that uses a creative way of expression. But what about those people who don't? What?
You have to squarely face your demons. You have to. And I did by writing about Vietnam.
Yeah.
And if they haven't, perhaps over time, there's a thing they call compartmentalization, where you just take everything and you put it in this little box and you put it in a file cabinet and you close the drawer and lock it up and it stays there and never comes out, hopefully. That's one thing that happens. It may be that there's just never a resolution. That's another thing that can happen. I was fortunate that I was a communicator.
Yeah.
Very fortunate that I was able to see and do what I did. But I've told you before, it's not that I never had dreams. I wrote about one of them in Masters of the Art that was a very real Vietnam-related dream, but it wasn't related to the combat. It was related to the friends I lost. But in truth, the only recurring dreams that I ever had about my time in the Marines were about Paris Island. And I'd be at Paris Island, and I was, like, as a raw recruit, having to go through it all over again, and having that fear of the drill instructor. They traumatized me, I'll tell you.
That is, for sure.
And all I can tell you is, in recent years, I haven't had one of those dreams in a long time, but the last time I did, the drill instructors were treating me as an equal. So I feel that in dream analysis, I must have come to a point in my life where I finally lived up to their expectations.
There you go. There you go.
But that's the truth. I mean, I never really had nightmares about Vietnam, but I sure as heck had a couple about Paris Island. I'm like, oh God, don't send me back there again.
Well, it occurs to me here, and we just have a little more than a minute left, and it occurs to me, something that you said reminded me of, gosh, it seems so disconnected. My late friend Liz Aylshire, who used to do this show with me, she had written a book called 101 Ways You Can Help, How to Offer Comfort and Support to Those Who Are Grieving. She wrote the book in honor of her son, who died at 16 of bone cancer, and one of the key things she said in that book was that for her dealing with this horrible traumatic loss, that a person who is dealing with such a trauma, and I think it's the same thing with PTSD.
Oh, it is, yeah.
You have to tell the story to 100 different people, and then each time you tell it, the burden of carrying it, it's not that it goes away, it becomes easier to handle. So I think for people who do not have the skills of the communicator that you do, perhaps you can be the listener. You can be the person who listens, who asks the questions about the war, asks what it was like to be in the war, and maybe in that way there can be some help and some resolution. And then we have been showing throughout the show the government website, where you please go on there and you can get help, you can get referral for other resources that are available. And on that note, Ron, I'm sorry to say we are out of time. Thank you very much, because I love the personal viewpoint of such a big issue. I also want to thank my FB crew. I want to thank you in the viewing audience as well. I do know the value of time, and I very much appreciate the fact that you spent another evening with me. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Full Bloom is brought to you in part by the following: